This happened in the summer of 2022 when I was living alone in a second-floor apartment in Portland, Oregon. I was 25 at the time, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm. The apartment was nothing special. One bedroom, small kitchen, a living room with a balcony that overlooked the parking lot. The building itself was one of those generic three-story complexes with about 30 units total. It wasn't in a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't great either. Mostly young professionals and college students. I'd been living there for about 6 months when things started getting weird. It began with small things that I initially dismissed. I'd come home from work and noticed that items in my apartment had been moved slightly. A chair pushed back from the table, a book on my nightstand turned to a different page, the bathroom door open when I was certain I'd closed it. I thought maybe I was just forgetful or stressed from work. But then I started noticing the same car parked in the lot at odd hours. It was a dark blue sedan, nothing remarkable about it, but it was always in the same spot near the entrance, and whoever was inside never got out. One night around 11 p.m. I was getting ready for bed when I looked out my balcony door and saw the car again. This time, I could make out someone sitting in the driver's seat. They appeared to be looking up at the building, specifically at my floor. I stepped back from the glass and watched from the side. The person sat there for another 20 minutes before finally driving away. The next morning, I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Patricia. She got this strange look on her face and asked me to describe the car. When I did, she nodded slowly and said she'd seen it too, multiple times over the past few weeks. That evening, I was washing dishes when I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was the distinct jingle of keys, followed by someone trying to unlock my door. The handle turned slightly, then stopped. I heard footsteps quickly walking away down the hallway. I immediately called 911. The dispatcher was calm and said they'd send an officer. While I waited, I checked my door. It was still locked, no damage to the lock or frame, but someone had definitely tried to get in. 2 officers arrived about 15 minutes later. I explained everything. The moved items, the car in the parking lot, and now someone trying my door. They took notes and checked the hallway, but there was no one around. They said without evidence of forced entry or a clear threat, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. I asked about the car in the parking lot, and they said unless it was blocking something or the owner was causing a disturbance, they couldn't do anything about someone sitting in their car on public property. After they left, I felt helpless. I installed a chain lock on my door and started keeping my curtains closed at all times. 2 nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that still gives me chills. Someone was scratching at my balcony door. Not knocking, but scratching, like fingernails slowly dragging across the glass. I grabbed my phone and crept to the living room. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anyone through the curtains, but I could hear them breathing on the other side of the glass. I called 911 again. This time I whispered into the phone that someone was actively trying to break in. The dispatcher kept me on the line while officers were sent. The scratching stopped after a few minutes, but I stayed frozen in place until I heard sirens approaching. By the time the police arrived and checked the balcony, whoever had been there was gone. The officers found scratch marks on the glass, deep enough to leave visible marks. But they explained that without catching the person in the act, there was little they could do. They suggested I install cameras and consider a restraining order if I knew who was doing this. But that was the problem. I had no idea who it was. The next day, I bought a security camera and installed it on my balcony. That night, around 2 a.m., the camera detected movement. I watched the live feed on my phone as a figure climbed over from the neighboring balcony onto mine. They were wearing dark clothes and a hood, making it impossible to see their face. They approached my glass door, looked directly at the camera, and stood there for several minutes just staring. Then they pulled out a phone and mine buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It said, "I can see you watching." My blood went cold. They somehow knew I was watching the camera feed in real time. I immediately called the police and sent them the video footage. This time the officers seemed more concerned. They reviewed the footage and said it was definitely evidence of stalking and trespassing. But they explained that identifying the person from the footage would be difficult, and unless they caught them on the property, charges would be hard to pursue. They did check the neighboring balcony where the person had come from, but that apartment was vacant, going through renovations. Anyone could have accessed it from the building's common areas. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I gave my notice to the landlord. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I needed to get out. During my last week there, nothing else happened. The car stopped appearing in the parking lot, and no one tried my door or balcony again. It was like whoever had been watching me knew I was leaving and had moved on. I moved to a different part of the city, into a building with better security and a doorman. I never found out who had been stalking me or why they'd chosen me as a target. The worst part was that feeling of powerlessness. I did everything I was supposed to do, called the police, documented everything, installed cameras. But until something more serious happened, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. This happened to my mom in 2019. She was living alone in a small house in a suburban neighborhood in New Jersey after my dad passed away. She was 58 at the time, retired from teaching, and generally kept to herself. The neighborhood was quiet and safe, or at least it always had been. Mostly families and retirees who'd lived there for decades. Everyone knew everyone, and people still left their doors unlocked during the day. It started in late fall. My mom told me she'd been getting strange phone calls on her landline. She still had one because she'd never felt comfortable giving up the home phone she'd had for 30 years. The calls would come at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early morning. When she answered, no one would speak. Just silence or sometimes what sounded like breathing. At first, she thought it was telemarketers or wrong numbers, but the frequency increased. Sometimes 3 or 4 calls a day, always from a blocked or unknown number. Then the calls started getting worse. Someone would speak, but it was always just 1 or 2 words, barely audible, things like soon or watching, or once, disturbingly, her name. My mum was scared but didn't want to worry me. She called the phone company and they suggested she change her number. She did, and for about a week the calls stopped. Then they started again, on the new number. She reported it to the police. They came to her house, took a statement and explained that harassing phone calls were hard to track, especially from blocked numbers. They suggested she document everything and consider not answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. But here's where it got really disturbing. My mom started noticing things around her house that didn't make sense. Her mailbox would be open when she was sure she'd closed it. The garden hose in her backyard would be uncoiled and stretched across the lawn. Small items from her porch, a plant, a doormat, would go missing and then reappear days later in different locations. She called the police again. They said it could be neighborhood kids or animals, but they'd increase patrols in the area. They still couldn't do much without catching someone in the act. One morning, my mum went to get her newspaper from the driveway and found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. It was handwritten and said, "I know you're alone." That's when she called me, finally. I drove up from Philadelphia that same day. When I got there, she showed me the note and told me everything that had been happening. I immediately called the police and showed them the note. They took it as evidence and said they'd dust it for fingerprints, but warned that it was unlikely to yield results. They did, however, start treating the situation more seriously. An officer suggested my mum stay somewhere else for a few days while they investigated. She refused, saying this was her home and she wasn't going to be scared out of it. Instead, I stayed with her for a week. During that time, nothing happened. No phone calls, no disturbances, nothing. It was like whoever was doing this knew I was there. The day after I left to go back to Philadelphia, the calls started again. This time, they were more frequent and more explicit. The caller would describe my mom's daily routine, what time she got her mail, when she turned on her porch light, what she'd been wearing that day. She was terrified and called me immediately. I told her to pack a bag and come stay with me, but she was stubborn. Instead, I hired a security company to install cameras around her property and a new alarm system. The cameras caught something within the first 2 days. At 11 p.m., a figure approached my mum's house from the street. They walked around the perimeter slowly, stopping at each window as if trying to look inside. They were wearing a dark hoodie and kept their head down, making it impossible to identify them. The figure then approached the front door and just stood there for several minutes before walking away. My mum called the police immediately and sent them the footage. They came to review it, but said the person hadn't actually done anything illegal. Walking around a house from public property wasn't trespassing, and without being able to identify them, they couldn't investigate further. The officer did say, however, that the behavior combined with the phone calls constituted stalking, and they would file a report that could be used if the situation escalated. But my mum wanted something done now, not after something worse happened. She felt like she was being told to wait until she was actually attacked before anyone could help her. 2 nights later, my mum woke up at 2 a.m. to someone ringing her doorbell repeatedly. She looked through the peephole but couldn't see anyone. The ringing continued for several minutes, then stopped. When she checked the security footage the next morning, it showed the same hooded figure standing at her door, ringing the bell. After they left, they walked down the street and got into a car parked 2 houses down, but the angle and darkness made it impossible to see the license plate or identify the vehicle. That was the final straw for my mum. She packed up and came to stay with me indefinitely. She put her house up for sale and refused to go back, even to pack her things. I hired movers to do it for her. The house sold within a month. The new owners, a young couple, moved in, and as far as I know, nothing strange has happened to them. My mum never found out who was harassing her or why it stopped after she moved out. The police told us that whoever it was likely knew her routine and may have had some personal connection or fixation on her specifically. To this day, she won't get a landline phone. She only uses her cell, and she keeps her number private. She still gets anxious when the phone rings, especially if it's from a number she doesn't recognize. This happened to me in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. I was moving from Austin to Dallas for a new job and needed to put some of my stuff in storage for a few months while I found a permanent place to live. I rented a climate-controlled unit at a facility on the outskirts of Austin. It was one of those large complexes with hundreds of units, security gates and cameras everywhere. I figured my stuff would be safe there. I loaded up the unit over a weekend, boxes of clothes, some furniture, books and electronics. Nothing particularly valuable, but things I didn't want to get rid of. I locked it up with a heavy-duty padlock and didn't think much about it. About 2 weeks later, I needed to grab some winter clothes I'd packed away. I drove to the facility, used my access code to get through the gate, and headed to my unit. When I got there, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My padlock was still on the unit, but it looked different. The position was slightly off, like someone had removed it and put it back. I unlocked it and raised the door. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as I walked inside, I realized things had been moved. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Boxes weren't stacked the way I'd left them. A chair was turned at a different angle. I checked my stuff, and nothing seemed to be missing, which made it even more confusing. Why would someone break into a storage unit and not steal anything? I went to the facility office and reported it. The manager pulled up the security footage for my unit's corridor. We watched several hours of video, but there was nothing suspicious. Just me coming and going. The manager suggested maybe I'd misremembered how I'd arranged things, or maybe the cleaning crew had been in there. But storage units don't have cleaning crews, and I knew someone had been in there. I added a second lock to the unit and made a note of exactly how everything was positioned. I even took photos with my phone to document it. 2 weeks later, I went back to grab more items. Both locks were still in place, still locked. But when I opened the unit, things had been moved again. This time it was more obvious. A box that had been on the bottom of a stack was now on top. A lamp that had been in the back corner was now in the middle of the unit. I immediately went back to the office. The manager seemed annoyed this time, like I was making up stories or being paranoid. He checked the footage again. Nothing. No one had entered except me. I asked to see the footage of the entire building for those 2 weeks. He said that wasn't possible without a police report, and even then, he'd need corporate approval. I called the police and filed a report. An officer came to the facility, looked at my unit and took some notes, but he explained that without proof of theft or damage, there wasn't much they could investigate. He suggested I install a camera in my unit if I was concerned. The facility didn't allow cameras in individual units, but I bought a small battery-powered one anyway and hid it behind a box, angled to capture the entrance. I checked the camera feed remotely every day. For a week, nothing happened. Then, on the 8th day, the camera stopped transmitting. When I checked the app, it showed the camera had been disconnected. I drove to the facility immediately. My locks were still in place. I opened the unit and found the camera on the floor smashed. And there, on top of a box in the center of the unit, was a note. It was written on lined paper in neat handwriting and said, "Stop watching." My hands were shaking as I called the police. This time, they took it more seriously. They came to the facility, took the note as evidence, and reviewed all the security footage again. The cameras showed me entering and leaving, but no one else. Yet, someone had clearly been in my unit, destroyed my camera and left a note. The officer suggested that someone with access to the facility, an employee or another renter who knew the system, might be involved. But without catching them in the act, there was little they could do. I cleaned out my unit that same day. I hired movers, transferred everything to a different facility across town, and demanded a refund from the original place. They refused, citing their terms of service. I never found out who had been accessing my unit or how they were getting in without appearing on camera. The police investigation went nowhere. What disturbed me most wasn't even the break-ins themselves. It was the feeling of being watched and the realization that someone could access my things whenever they wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I still have that note. I kept it as a reminder that sometimes, no matter how many precautions you take or how many times you ask for help, you're on your own.